Welcome back, everybody. Today we're going to talk about strengths and weaknesses of different types of experiments. So, now we discussed three different types of experiments. Number 1 was laboratory experiment, number 2 field experiment, and number 3 natural experiment. So let's take, for example, our laboratory experiment first. So let's say I want to talk about strengths of laboratory experiments. So let's think about it for a minute, right? When you think, what would you say is the strength of a laboratory experiment? Well, one you would say is a laboratory experiment, since the basis and the structure of laboratories are pretty much same across the world, right? Like everybody has to follow a certain set of like standards and rules to conduct their research according to their countries. So I would say the number one strength of a laboratory experiment would be easily replicable, which means that multiple testing equals to same result. And this can also be said that the laboratory experiment is more than likely to be true. So it will give you consistent answers based on multiple experiments, and doesn't matter wherever in the world you do them, they're going to be the same answer, right? So that's our number one. Number two. What would you say number two would be? I would say number two would be high level of control, which would basically mean that researchers would be really confident that independent variable will be the only thing that will affect the dependent variable. So the cause would be the only reason for the effect. Because it's easier to eliminate all the other variables in a laboratory experiment. Okay, so since that's done, let's now move on towards our weaknesses. Now, the first weakness that comes into mind is going to be ecological relevance, as the experiment was in artificial environment. So, more than likely, you will see that in real life scenarios, you will never see a relation directly between an independent variable and a dependent variable. You will always see a whole bunch of independent variables affecting a whole bunch of dependent variables. So that comes in sort of a critique for the laboratory experiment that, wait a minute, this is not applicable in real life situations, but it's really useful to determine how singular cause and effect relationship takes place. But there's multiple causes for multiple effects in a real life situation, right? Let's say, for example, you're happy today. Could be a number of different reasons. Maybe because, you cooked your favorite meal today, or you got good grades, or, you know, you're gonna hang out with your friends later on, you're excited. Could be a number of different reasons. Okay, so moving on to number two. Number two would be participant management. So, in this aspect, I would say that participant management is one of the challenging parts in a laboratory experiment, because you see, you have to manage people, and there could be a number of different sorts of people, uh, everyone with different characteristics, and you have to, for example, first of all, the resources of people. So bringing people in, like for example at my university, what they do to bring people in is offer them 3% on their course, so that they can just add that towards any course that they want, and they can be part of a laboratory experiment, right? And like that's some sort of, you can say, a bribery or reward for being part of it. So researchers quite often have to do stuff like that in order to get volunteers and participants and like sampling to engage. Okay, so your number two is gonna be your field experiment. Right. So first of all, we'll start off with strengths of a field experiment. So what strengths come into our mind when we think of a field experiment? So the number one that would come to mind is going to be like the opposite of the weakness that we just discussed up at the laboratory experiment. It is going to be, so a field experiment is more than likely going to be unbothered by researchers. It's going to be altered at all. So it's going to have ecological validity, validity, sorry, as limited control by researchers, right? Okay, and then we moved on to number two, which is going to be less hassle of participant management. So think about it, right? For your field experiment, the weaknesses for the laboratory experiment just flip around and become strengths for a field experiment. So that really boggles your mind. You're like, okay, so what are the weaknesses going to be for a field experiment? So I would say the number one weakness would be the opposite of the strength, number two, in a laboratory experiment. So it's going to be uncertainty, whether your main independent variable, so basically your cause, is the actual reason the dependent variable is affected, right? So is the cause the actual reason why the effect is happening? You never know because you're in a field experiment. You can't control that. There's going to be numerous numbers, you know, numbers of different um, independent variables affecting, let's say, if you're studying just one variable, right? Okay, so let's move on to number 2 for a field experiment. So number 2 is going to be like, let's see, you're in a field experiment, right? No one knows that they have limited knowledge of you studying them or researching them. So this is going to be an ethical gray area of consent. Basically, the people haven't consented, or your research subjects haven't consented to being researched on or to be studied, right? So that comes into an ethical problem. Okay, so moving on towards our natural experiment. So if I go towards natural experiment and I ask you that, what would you say are the strengths and weaknesses of a natural experiment? Well, I would say that the number one strength of a natural experiment would be the fact that the independent variable is occurring naturally, which translates into high ecological validity, right? So this basically means that you don't have to induce independent variable, right? It is occurring naturally. That also means that it has a high ecological validity, which basically means that in real life applications, it is highly, highly applicable, right? And like you are more than likely to see this sort of consistency from the independent variable if proven in more real life applications. Okay, so and then we move on to strength number 2. It would be valid representation of participants. So this basically means that a natural experiment, right? A natural experiment removes all the other stress factors and anxiety factors, any sort of biases a particular participant or number of participants would have against a you know um, different sort of experiment where they know that they're being tested. They're in their natural environment, right? In a natural experiment, they're in their natural environment, so they're more than likely to be in their natural behavior, act how they act, which is more than likely going to increase a likelihood of getting the most authentic, precise, accurate um, effect of a cause, which basically means the effect caused by the independent variable on the dependent variable, right? So let's move swiftly on to weaknesses. Okay, so weakness number 1 would be, in my opinion, or like as per your book, the weakness number 1 can be the same, that independent variable might not be the only cause for the dependent variable. Again, same as we thought in the field experiment, right? So I don't have to explain this again. This is pretty much the same, but it is more intense as compared to a field experiment. Number two is replicability. This means the repeat of a particular sort of natural experiment, right? So what do you think is the probability that the exact same way a natural experiment happens on one side of the world, it happens the exact same way on the other side of the world? I would say the probability is pretty much near to zero. So it is very, very, very unlikely to get copied, right? So as I was talking about the valid representation of participants and right up there about it being, occurring same times, I was talking about the effect occurring the same time, right? Over here we're talking about the replicability, which is basically means that the whole experiment being done the same way with same sort of methods in the same environment and in the same manner, right? Like every independent variable, every participant, everything, every factor would have to be the exact same, which is basically impossible, right? So I hope this helped with like outlining different things for you and strengths and weaknesses for the experiments, and this would furthermore clarify that concept that you have in your mind. Again, I would encourage you to read your books and your notes again after you're done watching this video, because you see, this is more so to clear your concept, right? For when you're in your exam, to write down that particular wording, that professional wording. You don't want to write down exact like this, right? You don't want to use the equal to signs and stuff like that, right? You want to have more better wording. So I would encourage you, and I would encourage you to read, and I would encourage you to form better wordings for these answers, right? Anyway, so moving on. One last thing in experiments, I would like to clarify two different things. Thing number one would be an experimental condition. So an experimental condition basically suggests that you take in account for everything. You take the independent variable, you change its intensities, right? Dependent variable, and then when you, let me just do this, when you increase or decrease the intensity of an independent variable, does that affect the dependent variable, right? This basically tells you if there's some sort of proportion between these two, right? If there's some sort of proportion, and it would further define if it's directly proportional or indirectly proportional. Basically, establish that relationship between them to even further. And then a second thing would be a control condition. What does a control condition mean? Well, I would say it basically means that you test the dependent variable in the absence of the independent variable. This basically, clarifies that if there actually is any sort of effect, from the independent variable on the dependent variable, right? For example, if the independent variable is like basically gone, right? And the dependent variable is isolated and it shows the same sort of behavior, that really, makes you think like, wait a minute, does the independent variable actually have some sort of negative positive effect on the dependent variable? like, is there actually a relation between the two? Okay, so that would be our wind up between, different sort of experiments and their types. So I'm just gonna add this. So we're pretty much done with experiments. Now, moving on towards self-reports. Self-reports are used to gather qualitative data. Let me just write that down in simple wording. Used to gather qualitative data from the subjects or participants, right? So don't get confused when I mention a word like qualitative. What does qualitative basically mean? Well, I would say qualitative means some sort of verbal data, right? So you'll better understand when I compare qualitative to its, opposite sibling, which would be quantitative. Quantitative data would be something like your age, your height, your weight, right? It has a number, it has an empirical value. So, and then if you go to the other side, qualitative data, right, as compared to quantitative data, qualitative data would have, for example, certain structures, types, like what type of build do you have? Do you have athletic build, right? Do you have a tall, slender build, right? That's your qualitative data. So verbal data in some sense. Like when you will go down and further into any research course, wherever you take one, if you ever take one, there is more to it. But for now, for this assessment, I think this is enough that you know that what the basic idea of qualitative data is. Okay, so speaking of qualitative data, there are two types of qualitative data, right? Oh, sorry. I mean, there are two types of self-reports, not qualitative data. There are two types of self-reports. You have your questionnaire, which is basically, just you answering on a piece of paper, and then you have an interview. An interview is usually with the researcher or the research assistant, right, to gather data from you. Now, there are further qualifications, there's further categorization between all these, so I will discuss those in the next page. So I'm gonna take out questionnaire first. There are 4 different type of questionnaires. 4 different type of questionnaires. Number 1 is going to be your Likert scale. So, what does a Likert scale do? A Likert scale is simply the type of questionnaire where it asks a participant or a subject whether they liked or disliked something, right? So make it easier for you in the exam, right? Likert, like, right? Think of that in this sense, whether they liked or disliked something. So Likert scale, right? And then the next thing you would have is your rating scale. Now, a rating scale is something where it is a form of, or a let's say, type of quantitative data. Right? Focus on it. Quantity. It basically helps you put in your feedback in terms of numerics. So an example of this would be, let's say, example, how much do you enjoy psychology? And then you have this scale over here from 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Now, this is very easily classified as a rating scale. So let's say you absolutely love psychology, so you circle a 10. Here is your numerical value, and this is your rating scale. And this is something that we call a quantitative type of data, right? Okay, and moving on, so you after this have something like open questions. So what are open questions? I would say open questions are basically open-ended questions in which participant or subject is free to answer however they like. So with this question, you basically have, a sort of independence and a sort of freedom on how you want to express your answer, right? So that would be an open question. Any example would be a essay. Let's say you have to write down an essay. Usually essay is like a question to which you answer, how you prefer to or want to, and how you think the data is going to be best relayed, right? And then you have after this your closed questions. Now you get the idea by comparing open questions. So when you think of closed questions would be something like you only have a certain answers from which you have to choose. So certain answers to choose. So a very good example, which you probably would have guessed by now, is going to be MCQs, your multiple choice questions, right? So keep that in mind. Okay, so you are done with your 4 type of questionnaires, and yep. So moving on. Okay, so let's say, oh, I think I added the page at the wrong area. I'm gonna just move that to trash. I'm gonna add another page right after. Okay, so let's move on. Now we have 3 different types of interviews, right? So I'm just gonna write down 3 types of interviews. So let's say interview type number 1, a structured interview. So what would you say are the characteristics of a structured interview? Well, let's dive into the characteristics together, right? And the interviewer, the person performing the interviewer, has strict instructions to ask only specific questions in a certain manner. So, when I say certain manner, what do I mean? Well, I would say even like stuff like the tone, eye contact, right? And like there's a whole bunch of different examples I can do. Um, let's say attitude. Everything is regulated in a structured interview. You can only ask specific questions in a certain manner, right? So then we have a semi-structured interview. So what would I say is a semi-structured interview? Well, interviewer, again, pretty much the same, but not as strict. But let me just put that into a better sense. Interviewer has certain questions but can inquire more for clarification. So, interviewer has certain questions but can inquire more for clarification. And your mannerisms, right? So, basically, tone, body language, mannerisms are usually flexible. So you have certain questions, but you can ask more to get further clarifications. You can add or, reduce some to get that specific, answer to like, cut those edges off from, your data. And your mannerisms are pretty much flexible, usually. Right. Okay, so let's move on to unstructured interview. Now, what is an unstructured interview? So, in an unstructured interview, it's just usually the interviewer covers certain topics with the respondent and further further questions are based on the respondent's answer. Now, the reason why I write this, and also verbally describe it to you is because, so it's easier for you to take notes. If you're taking any notes, it's easier for you to understand. And also, of course, my writing is like bad, but that's irrelevant. So, um, excuse me. So usually the interviewer covers certain topics, right? So the interview is already given like a list of topics that you need to cover, and they discuss those topics, and the interviewers ask questions based on where the conversation goes and where he thinks is the best direction to take the conversation in to gather the most amount of data, right? Okay. And that is your three types of interviews. Awesome. So I am going to end this over here for today, and the next time we come back, we are going to discuss the strengths and weaknesses of interviews and questionnaires. Okay, see you all soon, and hope you are enjoying so far.